Hey, it's Brian Winter. If you love the America's Quarterly podcast, please consider becoming a member of our parent organization, America's Society. For 60 years, America's Society has been the House of Latin America in New York. We're a not-for-profit organization that depends on members like you to keep this podcast going. Your membership will help support our work, and it will also give you special access to in-person events in New York City, virtual programs for members outside of New York, and 4 print issues a year of America's Quarterly. All of that for as little as $70 a year. Learn more on our website at as-coa.org. That's as-coa.org. Welcome to the America's Quarterly podcast. I'm Brian Winter. The Trump administration is threatening Brazil with tariffs and other punishments unless the Supreme Court drops charges against former President Jair Bolsonaro. On today's podcast, we'll look at the motivations, tactics, and possible paths forward in this confrontation.
When Trump looks at Bolsonaro, he sees himself in Bolsonaro. He identifies with the challenges that he's facing. And so it's very personal. And when you look at the accusations of the conservatives in Brazil to censorship, social media regulation, it rings true to Republicans in the MAGA movement and those around the president. It is a political environment ripe for a very poisonous bilateral relationship.
A confrontation between the United States and Brazil was almost inevitable. The return of President Donald Trump to the White House coincided with an escalating criminal case against his friend and ally, former President Jair Bolsonaro, on charges he tried to overturn Brazil's 2022 election. President Trump has called that case a witch hunt, the exact same term Trump used when he himself was facing criminal charges. Trump now says Brazil will face 50% tariffs unless Brazil drops the case. The U.S. government has also stripped 8 of Brazil's 11 Supreme Court judges of their U.S. visas and launched an investigation into whether Brazil's policies on digital trade and electronic payment services, tariffs, and other matters are a burden to U.S. commerce. This has led to a certain deadlock. The Brazilian government of President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva argues that the country's judiciary is independent and that it therefore cannot simply order charges against Bolsonaro to be dropped. President Trump also does not seem interested in retreating on this one. So where do we go from here? What are the political and economic stakes for each side in both the short and long term? And where, if anywhere, might a solution come from? We've invited someone who's watching this very closely. He's a previous guest on the AQ podcast and a friend, Chris Garman, Managing Director for the Americas at the Eurasia Group. Chris, welcome back to the AQ podcast.
Thank you, Brian. Real pleasure to be here again.
Chris, I outlined in the introduction just how intractable this conflict seems as we record this. Before we get into the details, though, I was hoping that you could talk to us about kind of your version of how we got here. How did we end up with such an existential battle between the two largest nations of the Americas?
Listen, Brian, obviously there have been some surprises along the way, particularly, the extent and the size of the tariffs that were announced on Brazil. But I think that when we began, this Trump administration, we always identified, and I always felt at Eurasia Group that this would be a very poisonous bilateral relationship. And the most important reason is that ultimately Brazil's politics mirror U.S. politics in a very uncanny fashion. When Trump looks at Bolsonaro, he sees himself in Bolsonaro. He identifies with the challenges that he's facing. And so it's very personal. And when you look at the accusations of the conservatives in Brazil to censorship, social media regulation, it rings true to Republicans in the MAGA movement and those around the president. So it is a political environment ripe for a very poisonous bilateral relationship. You add the fact that Brazil is slowly drifting towards China just for self-interested economic reasons. And then you had the unhappy fortune of Brazil hosting the BRICS summit, which gives more visibility towards it. So you kind of had, what we had the stars aligning this year, 3 events: ruling against Bolsonaro, a court ruling of the Supreme Court against social media companies, or at least to regulate social media companies, and the hosting of the BRICS summit. And so the table was set.
Chris, I know that within Brazil especially, there's been some questioning as to President Trump's main motivation in this dispute. There's been some talk that this is actually about stopping Brazil's drift toward China. There's another view that, as you put it, that this is very personal, that actually what he does want is for the charges against Bolsonaro, former President Bolsonaro, to be dropped and for his political rights to be restored. This is not just an academic debate, because it very much tells us how likely or not we are to see a resolution of this in the short or medium term. What's your understanding of President Trump's motivations?
I think that this is more about the trial of Jair Bolsonaro. He sees himself in Jair Bolsonaro's predicaments. And equally, like a close second, is the more excessive social media regulation, which he also hurts American corporate interests on the one hand, and he views it from a political lens as equivalent to political censorship on the other. I think those are the 2 larger drivers. There are many other countries in the global south that are drifting towards China. None of them have received the size of the punitive tariffs that Brazil has received. So I think that the China explanation is insufficient to be able to explain, what's going on.
Chris, as we record this, it's been almost 2 weeks since President Trump made this threat of tariffs. We have seen almost all parties involved in this confrontation escalating, shoving their chips into the middle of the table, going all in. And I'm talking about the Bolsonaro family. I'm talking about President Trump and his administration. And I'm also talking about President Lula. Each of these parties seem to think that they have something to gain. Do you see any way out of this for now? Or do you think, again, as we record this, we're likely to see further escalation before things start to get better?
Yeah, Brian, I think that the 2 more likely scenarios that we've been debating, at Eurasia Group is, I think the least likely of all is that we have a version of a deal and a climb down to the 50% tariffs that were announced and set to roll in on the 1 August. I think that the real debate is, do we have a version of a muddle through with the current equilibrium without a meaningful escalation, or do we have a meaningful escalation of measures that go above and beyond just the commercial tariffs, right? I think that's kind of the larger debate. I think that the room for a deal, kind of like we're seeing in other countries, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, of a 20% tariff, I think is very, very difficult for us to attain given the political motivations for this impasse. And you're right, we're in an equilibrium where President Lula is benefiting politically from the Trump tariffs. It's creating a nationalist wave. His approval ratings are rising. It is putting the opposition Bolsonarista in a difficult situation because they're being associated with punitive tariffs that can take away jobs from Brazil. And so from a purely political point of view, the presidential palace is in a very comfortable position. The caveat I would say, though, Brian, is when we look at actions, the Lula administration has not taken any retaliatory measures against the Trump tariffs. I think that there is a concern in the presidential palace of retaliating against U.S. measures and generating a tit-for-tat escalation with the U.S. that could generate more damage from an economic point of view. Because up until now, a 50% tariff level hurts a number of Brazilian sectors, but from a macroeconomic point of view, the repercussions are relatively modest. We're talking about exports representing less than 2% of Brazil's GDP. We're talking about shaving 0.2, 0.3% of GDP. It's not really leading to a currency crisis. So you can accommodate and swallow that. But if you start moving for a tit for tat of retaliation that gets into foreign direct investments, and other aspects of the bilateral relationship, then the economic costs could pile up. So what we're seeing is a presidential palace that Lula is upping the ante on the rhetoric, but he is being cautious in refraining from specific retaliatory actions. The problem is that the Supreme Court is upping the ante, and they're retaliating to the Trump tariffs by first taking the cautionary, the measures against Jair Bolsonaro. Now they're taking measures against his son, and we're going to have a trial. And the Trump administration is viewing the court measures as escalation, because the Trump administration is not distinguishing between restraint from the presidential palace and court decisions, because they view both as part of a regime. And that's why this is a dangerous environment, because it's not just up to the presidential palace whether they want to escalate or not, because part of the court actions are above and beyond their control, and they're an actor that is interpreted by the Trump administration as escalatory. And so then the presidential palace has to respond to retaliations from the Trump administration to court decisions, which is independent of the executive office. That's why it's so hard it's a little bit harder to handicap where this is going.
Chris, it's worth noting here that some of the actions taken by the judiciary, and specifically by Judge Alexandre de Moraes, are, at minimum, very difficult to understand from an American point of view. He has forbidden former President Bolsonaro from having contact with his son or using his social media feeds. More recently, he has even prohibited other people and entities, including the press, from circulating new video of President Bolsonaro online. These are decisions that have given fuel to the Bolsonaro family's argument that Judge Moraes is acting in an authoritarian way.
Oh, that's right. And this is all prior to any conviction of a legal case. So these are, what they call medidas cautelares, which is, that the courts can take a decision to restrict movement and access of individuals who could be seen as undermining legal investigations, risk of flight, and so on and so forth. There is a legal basis for those decisions, but even amongst kind of legal circles in Brazil, I think what most would agree is that it's not completely out of the norm, but, it is still controversial in Brazil, the aggressiveness of these decisions. And of course, what it conveys is the fact that it comes immediately after a 50% tariff rate from the Trump administration. It does seem to be a tit for tat, but you're absolutely right. It's hard to understand from an American point of view. It is easily interpreted as an escalation, and it makes everything more difficult on negotiating, any type of off-ramp on the bilateral commercial side.
Chris, you mentioned that Brazil, economically speaking, can probably live with something like the status quo in terms of these tariffs and other sanctions. But you alluded also to the possibility that all of us are thinking about of further escalation. What is your appraisal of the tools that the Trump administration may be considering, potentially not just tariffs, but other tools as well?
Yeah, no, Brian, good question. We can think about a scale of, least likely to more likely. Let's start with the least likely items, some of which have been leaked to the press. One that has been making the rounds, which I think is highly unlikely, is to exclude Brazil from the SWIFT payment system. This is an international body based in Belgium. It is a governance with multiple countries. The U.S. couldn't do that even if they wanted. And I think it's just, Russia was excluded from the SWIFT payments. These are very extreme events. I don't think that's in the cards. Another proposal that was floated to the press is to restrict the use of the global positioning system, the GPS, for Brazil. Again, it seems like a very outlandish measure. Legally, is questionable. It would hurt U.S. corporate interests operating in Brazil. Again, I would put that in the very unlikely category. What is more likely? I think that the immediate one that everyone is looking at is, can you extend the punishments and sanctions against members of the court? Not only do you revoke the visas for members of the court and their family members, but you can invoke the Global Magnitsky Act, which would be a more severe level of sanctioning, of which it would, sequester, assets of these individuals held in the United States. And it could prevent them from holding bank accounts in institutions that have access to U.S. capital markets, because those institutions could be liable to secondary sanctions. In other words, so these ministers of the court may not even be able to hold bank accounts in Brazilian banks like Itaú or Bradesco, or it would put those banks liable to sanctions from the U.S. That's a pretty serious sanction. It is a bit of a stretch to use it for the Brazilian case, but that's something I think is being considered. The other is, you can increase the rate of tariffs from 50 to 100% to the extent that you have legal cases moving, against Bolsonaro more aggressively. At a certain level, a tariff rate of 50 or 100 doesn't make much difference because these are trade prohibitive measures, but nevertheless, you could move down that way. Third, I would say you could extend visa restrictions for members outside of the court for the Brazilian administration. So you look at the threats given against Colombia and Gustavo Petro, that was a list of threats that the Trump administration had. So I would look at the threats given to Colombia as a potential blueprint for additional measures. You could talk about maybe, some tech transfers or restrictions on FDI. That's a little bit tougher because you impact U.S. corporate interests. But, those are kind of some of the range of things that we're talking about that could come out of the Trump White House. I think something else will be coming.
So you mentioned the toolkit that was briefly brandished in the confrontation that the Trump administration had with President Petro of Colombia back in January. I was in Colombia that day. It was a coincidence, although nobody really believes that. And there was concern that day that specifically the OFAC sanctions, the Treasury sanctions that were mentioned, that it could have destroyed the Colombian economy had that confrontation not been resolved before markets open the next day. It was a confrontation that happened somewhat fortunately for Colombia on a Sunday. I mean, is there anything else? Are we thinking creatively enough? I mean, is there anything? And I ask this because President Trump has a record of responding dramatically when others escalate a confrontation like this, especially when there is asymmetry, as there is in this case. Or is there anything else that we should be thinking of along those lines that would really, in his mind, force the issue?
Yeah, I think that OFAC sanctions have to be on the list. And you're absolutely correct. I think that there are a couple stages to this crisis. One is, what will Trump do in response to even the recent court decisions to restrict Bolsonaro's movements, and a highly likely ruling against him in the month of September, which will probably lead to imprisonment. So something will come from the Trump administration sooner or later. It could be sooner, either actions against members of the court or potentially upping the ante on the tariffs. And then we have to map out, well, how will the Brazilians respond to that? I think that the inclination in the Brazilian government is to show restraint and not respond. But there are certain levels of actions from the Trump White House of which not doing anything is politically difficult to swallow. And so then we're going to have, if Lula responds, a response coming out of the Trump administration to those. So there may be stages to this escalation. What is the saving grace? I would say is that Brazil is a country where the stock of foreign direct investment from U.S. companies is pretty large. It's something like the 8th or 9th largest, a market for FDI. And so the domestic lobby in the U.S., once you start to get to a larger confrontation, could start to rear in a way that it is quiet now. And that could potentially lead to escalation with a de-escalation at some point in the future.
So, Chris, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the actors in this confrontation who are interested in a peaceful resolution. This includes the private sectors in both countries. I suspect at some level, as you've been alluding to, that the Lula government sees some utility to this confrontation, but is also conscious of the fact that if it rages out of control, that it's bad for everybody. And there may also be voices in Washington, not necessarily in the White House, but in other places that also understand that a battle that rages out of control with the second largest country in the Western Hemisphere ultimately is, especially over time, strategically bad for the United States. Sitting here today, what does an exit from this look like? And I ask this because it's so hard, because you and I agree that the main and perhaps the only deliverable that would satisfy President Trump would be an end to the trial against Jair Bolsonaro and a restoration of his political rights. I just don't think that's on the table. So if you can't negotiate around that, where is there room to discuss?
No, I think that's why a grand bargain deal is very unlikely, Brian. Not only you can't negotiate the revocation of political rights of Jair Bolsonaro, but you also can't negotiate an unwinding of the court decision to regulate social media companies. That also seems non-negotiable. So I think that the best that we can expect or hope for is a world in which the escalation is limited on the presidential palace side, that they show restraint in not responding to some additional actions which are highly likely coming from the White House. And in not responding and showing restraint, that we don't have measures that are much more harmful to the Brazil's economy. And then what you can have is over time, have a negotiated exclusion of some items from the 50% tariff for self-interested reasons from the United States. You look at, for example, oil, critical minerals. These were excluded from the reciprocal tariff rates announced on the 2nd of April. There are some items on the trade balance that are impacting U.S. consumers more. There's a large share of Brazilian exports over U.S. imports in coffee, sugar, cellulose, even kind of steel and aluminum. So you can negotiate quotas of some of these items as well. That will take time, right? It's not something that you're going to do in the short term. And so what you have is the 50% tariffs holding with some exclusions that would lower the effective tariff rate from 50 to something closer to 30. That's the kind of climb down that I see over time. But what you have to avoid is a tit-for-tat escalation that the size of the damage is so large that you end up having a hard time walking back from that. That's kind of the challenge. There is a pathway for a modest de-escalation for self-interested reasons from the U.S. economy, but you have to have the dust settle for the technocrats in commerce and USTR to be able to play a larger role.
Well, that's just another element, Chris, that makes this so complicated because, as you already mentioned, this is a conflict that is destined to continue escalating because I was in Brazil for a week, the last week of June, before all of this blew up, but not that long ago either. And the universal expectation from people who I spoke to was that former President Bolsonaro, would be either arrested or put under house arrest before the year was over. And so, that continues to be the expectation as far as I can tell. In fact, maybe that timeline has now been accelerated because of this crisis. And so that tells you that even if there was some sort of climb down in the short term, there's something on the horizon that is bound to push everyone to, I'm sorry to keep using these war metaphors, but to DEFCON 1.
Yeah, that is coming. We're going to have a conviction and a arrest of Bolsonaro. The question, Brian, is how much restraint will the Lula administration show? Obviously we don't know how far the White House will go. I think that the presidential palace wants to show restraint, but they may be pushed to do something.
Chris, you mentioned the possibility of some sort of judicial solution, but even if a U.S. court eventually finds these tariffs illegal, President Trump has an uncanny way of achieving his objectives, especially in contentious cases like this. The only moment so far in this confrontation when I saw something like a pathway illuminate in front of us was when Flavio Bolsonaro, the president's son, who's also a senator, sent a tweet in which he said the right thing for President Trump to do would be to drop the 50% tariff and try to manage this crisis using targeted individual sanctions instead. Now, that tweet was deleted within a few hours of it being published, but it seems to suggest that there are concerns within the Bolsonaro family that this confrontation over time will not be good for them or their political standing. Can you talk a little bit about how this confrontation is playing out in Brazilian domestic politics and whether that might eventually lead the Bolsonaro family to try to find some kind of exit strategy?
No, that's I share that kind of light at the end of the tunnel pathway. I would add, not only is there a world in which the Bolsonaro family convinces President Trump to be able to walk back the tariffs on the one hand and take tougher action against members of the court on the other, but there's also the other pathway of de-escalation is Congress approving legislation that would give an amnesty for all those who were implicated over, the course of the transition of the election on accusations of undermining democracy. So there's a legislation in Congress that would essentially rid Bolsonaro and all those implicated from legal liability. And the opposition party of Bolsonaro is pushing to approve this bill. There are two problems with both of those pathways, or there's a problem with each of those pathways. The first is that, Flavio Bolsonaro posted that. He quickly took it down. And part of it is, I think that there is a view within the Bolsonaro family that there is no negotiating with the regime. They are going to put us in jail. They're going to liquidate our political rights. And ultimately, even though Eduardo Bolsonaro and the family weren't pushing for the 50% tariff, so, there is a view that you need to have maximal damage for the government overall, that it may hurt them in the short term, but if you're headed into a negative economic backdrop for 2026, it will ultimately help an opposition victory. And so we're seeing Eduardo and some of the people close to the president not wanting to ask for that de-escalation. Could they change their mind if Lula's numbers go up over the next couple of months, which they probably will, if Bolsonaro's standing is seen as allied with a government that is taking away jobs from Brazil, starts to inflict more damage, potentially. But I would say it's not something that we're going to see in the short term. I don't think it's not going to come in the next month or two. So we could have escalation before then. And then the problem with Congress is, House Speaker Hugo Mota is putting under pressure not to bring this bill to a vote. The Bolsonaro's public standing has gotten weakened a bit. And even if Congress approves this, if they put it to a vote, it'll probably get approved in the lower house. Even if this gets approved, the Supreme Court could rule it unconstitutional. So those are the way that both pathways for de-escalation seem a bit less likely.
Chris, can you talk to me about what you see as the role of the tech industry and specifically US-based tech companies in this confrontation? You mentioned that this is happening in a Brazil where regulation of these companies has increased in ways that, are almost an outlier globally, or even more stringent regulation than we've seen in Europe. What's your understanding of the role that some of the big tech companies, or if any, are playing in this dispute?
Yeah, I think that they have a double-edged sword role. On the one hand, the complaints of U.S. tech companies in a political and regulatory environment, which in Brazil that they view as adverse, probably contributed to punitive measures taken by the Trump administration. At the same time, Brazil is a big market for them, and they don't want to lose that market. So I think that is where, if we're in an escalatory cycle, that they could be a voice of moderation and restraint to make sure that, the large base of consumers and users to the U.S. tech companies remains there. So if they were an aggrieved party that contributed to measures against Brazil, they still have large economic stakes in Brazil, and they could be a voice of moderation to temper a more meaningful escalation.
Final question for you, Chris. I've said that this is an asymmetrical fight, that it carries very few short-term consequences for President Trump, that he may therefore see Brazil as kind of a perfect low-cost target. But that's all looking at the short term. I want to think a little bit more about the medium and long-term consequences of this, where I think that, the damage to the bilateral relationship between Brazil and the United States and to the interests potentially of both countries becomes much more of a risk. And in the case of Brazil, it's fairly clear how that might happen, that this incentivizes the Lula government to seek closer ties with China, but also potentially with the European Union, basically to depend less upon Washington and upon the U.S. What do you make of that possibility? And what other risks do you think there are in this confrontation that we're likely to see play out, not just in a matter of weeks, but in a matter of months and years?
Great question to put on the table, Brian. I would say that we're probably headed to a version of this world independent of what happens in the near term. I think that what we're seeing globally is that countries are doing whatever they can to avoid a larger damage to the bilateral relationship and access to the U.S. market, but they're quietly looking for hedging strategies to be able to rely less on the United States. And so this is a slow moving, story. It's not something that happens quickly. If you have a damaging bilateral relationship along that we're talking about either trade prohibitive tariffs or an escalation, it'll accelerate that movement. Because what it means is that you're going to have Brazilian exporters looking to find new markets to find, their destination. And it's hard to be able to reconquer access to the U.S. market. It takes years of work developing commercial relationships. And once you lose those relationships, right, it's hard to be able to come back. And so I think then it would be a world where Brazil will be closer to the European Union. It would drift closer towards China. It would look for deeper ties with Middle East and Southeast Asian markets. And strategically for the U.S., you end up losing leverage precisely when you're trying to be able to punish Brazil, to be able to, not get close towards China. The unintended consequence is that you lose leverage over, the largest country in South America, and you push them to some partners or competitors from a geopolitical point of view. I also think that when you look at it from the near term, Brian, I think we need to look as well as to where the overall trading relationships are headed, right? To tie the two together. We have a very important deadline on 1 August. And if we don't get a deal with the European Union, and we have the European Union retaliating against U.S. tariffs or South Korea or Japan, one thing is to whack Brazil and Brazil retaliating by themselves and nobody else retaliating against the U.S. The other thing is other large trading partners retaliating against the U.S. So it's just to throw an additional kind of, data into this equation, because if we're in a world where other trading partners start to retaliate against the U.S. and their view of being too accommodative didn't work, then the economic damage to the U.S. economy will be larger, and Trump could face domestic economic headwinds in next year from the inflation and growth side and face a bit of a setback on the midterm elections. In other words, the politics of keeping trade prohibitive tariff measures may shift domestically if Trump starts to weaken. So it could embolden Brazil to be retaliatory in the short term, but it could create the political conditions for an easing of these policies next year. So it is asymmetrical, but the damage to the U.S. economy is still a big open question mark. We're not seeing this on inflation. We're not seeing this on growth. Trump's numbers are holding up well, but there's a delay usually on these measures and how they impact domestically. We're really not going to see that until the end of the year in 2026.
Chris, thanks so much for joining us on the AQ Podcast.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.